What you're about to witness has never been captured on camera before. A moment that will make you question everything you think you know about power, dignity, and what money can't buy. This is the story of how a single glance from a royal guard silenced one of the richest men in America. It was a crisp Tuesday morning at Buckingham Palace. The autumn mist clung to the iron gates as hundreds of tourists gathered for the changing of the guard ceremony. Among them stood a man whose net worth exceeded the GDP of small nations. Richard Blackwood, tech billionaire, venture capitalist, and someone who believed that everything in this world had a price tag. He'd flown in from Silicon Valley on his private jet, worth more than most people's lifetime earnings. Designer Italian shoes clicked against the cobblestones as he pushed through the crowd, his security detail trailing behind. But today, money wouldn't open the doors he expected. The royal guard stood motionless. 6 feet of pure discipline wrapped in scarlet wool and tradition. His bare skin had added another foot to his already commanding presence. This wasn't just a man in uniform. This was centuries of British heritage made flesh. Blackwood studied the guard like he studied stock portfolios, looking for weaknesses, calculating angles. His fingers drummed against his Hermes briefcase, the same nervous tic that had preceded every major acquisition of his career. But this wouldn't be a merger, this would be a lesson. The crowd pressed closer as cameras began flashing. Blackwood saw his opportunity. He'd heard the stories about these guards. How they never moved, never spoke, never broke character, but everyone had a price. At least that's what he'd learned building his empire. He approached with the confident swagger of a man who'd never heard the word no and meant it. His $1,000 suit contrasted sharply with the timeless military precision before him. Old world versus new world, tradition versus disruption. An unstoppable force meeting an immovable object. "Excuse me, soldier," Blackwood said, his voice carrying that particular American confidence that comes with having more zeros in your bank account than most people have in their phone numbers. The guard's eyes remained fixed forward, not even a flicker of acknowledgement. Blackwood smiled. He loved a challenge. In boardrooms across the world, that smile had preceded hostile takeovers worth billions. Today, it would precede his greatest failure. The billionaire reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew something that made several tourists gasp, a thick bundle of cash. More money than most people saw in a year, held casually between two fingers like it was nothing more than a business card. "I'll give you $10,000, he announced loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. $10,000 just to smile for one photograph. That's more than you make in 6 months, right?" The words hung in the air like smoke from cannon fire. The crowd fell silent. Even the street performers stopped their acts. Every phone camera turned toward this moment. History being made in real time, but the guard remained motionless. His rifle held at exactly the regulation angle. His white gloves spotless against the dark metal. His breathing so controlled, it seemed like he might not be breathing at all. This was discipline forged in centuries of tradition. Blackwood's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second. He wasn't used to being ignored. In his world, silence meant negotiation. It meant the price wasn't high enough, so he doubled down, the way he always did when faced with resistance. $20,000, he said, pulling out another bundle of bills. $20,000, cash, right now, just one smile. Just one break in that statue routine you've got going on. The money fluttered slightly in the morning breeze. Each bill worth more than most people's weekly salary. But money, as the guard knew, was just paper, and paper meant nothing compared to duty. Still no reaction, no acknowledgement that Blackwood existed. The guard's eyes remained locked on the horizon, seeing everything and focusing on nothing except his sworn duty. This wasn't stubbornness. This wasn't pride. This was something deeper, something the billionaire would never understand despite all his wealth. The crowd began to murmur, phones buzzed with messages. Social media posts were already going viral, but not in the way Blackwood expected. The comments weren't about the money, they were about something else entirely. 50,000, Blackwood announced, his voice starting to carry an edge of frustration that his board members would have recognized as dangerous. $50,000 for one photograph. That's more than most people's entire year. He held the money higher now, making sure every camera could see it. Making sure everyone understood the magnitude of what he was offering. But the guard understood something more important. He understood the magnitude of what was being asked. For the first time since this confrontation began, something changed, not in the guard's posture, not in his expression, not in his breathing, but something shifted in the air around them, like the moment before lightning strikes. The guard's eyes, which had been focused on the distant horizon, slowly began to move, not his head, just his eyes. The crowd held its breath as those pale blue eyes, trained by years of military discipline, began to track downward. Blackwood felt a surge of victory. Finally, a reaction. Finally, acknowledgement. He was about to achieve what hundreds of tourists failed to do every day. He was about to crack the code of Royal Guard discipline with nothing more than American courtesy. But as those eyes met his, Blackwood realized he'd made a terrible miscalculation. This wasn't surrender, this wasn't negotiation. This was something far more powerful than any amount of money could ever be. The guard's gaze locked onto Blackwood's face with the intensity of a laser sight. No emotion, no judgment, just pure, crystallized dignity meeting crass materialism. It was a look that seemed to see right through the designer suit, right through the wealth, right through the arrogance, and find something wanting. For 30 seconds, they stared at each other. The richest man in the crowd and the most disciplined. And in that silence, everyone watching understood which one possessed true power. Then, without warning, without a word, without even blinking, the guard's eyes moved back to the horizon. The moment was over. The confrontation was finished. And Blackwood was dismissed with nothing more than a glance. Blackwood stood there, $50,000 still clutched in his trembling hands, as the weight of that dismissal settled over him like a lead blanket. He'd been looked at, evaluated, and found wanting by a man who probably earned less in a year than Blackwood spent on lunch meetings. The crowd around them had grown thicker. Word was spreading through social media faster than wildfire. Videos were already being uploaded with captions like "Billionaire humiliated by Royal Guard" and "When money meets honor." But Blackwood wasn't done. He couldn't be done. His entire identity was built on getting what he wanted when he wanted it. 100,000, he announced, his voice now carrying a desperate edge that his competitors would have recognized as the sound of a drowning man. $100,000. That's more than you'll see in 5 years of this this statue routine. The guard's breathing remained steady, his posture unchanged. But something was happening in the crowd. The initial curiosity had transformed into something else. Murmurs of disapproval, whispers of disgust. The very tourists who had been impressed by the display of wealth were now beginning to understand what they were really witnessing. An elderly British woman pushed forward through the crowd, her walking stick tapping against the cobblestones with sharp, angry strikes. "Shame on you," she said, her voice cutting through the morning air like a blade. Absolute shame, but Blackwood barely heard her. His focus had narrowed to a tunnel vision that included only himself and the guard. This had become personal in a way that none of his business dealings ever had. This wasn't about money anymore. This was about validation. About proving that his way of seeing the world was correct. 200,000, he said, pulling out his phone and opening his banking app. "I'll transfer $200,000 right now. Cash, digital transfer, whatever you want. Just smile." Just once, the phone's screen glowed in the morning light, displaying numbers that represented more money than most families would see in a lifetime. But the guard's eyes never moved from their fixed point on the horizon. It was as if Blackwood and his money simply didn't exist. A young boy, no more than 8 years old, tugged on his mother's coat sleeve. "Mummy," he whispered loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear, "why is that man trying to buy the soldier?" The innocent question hit like a physical blow. Out of the mouths of babes came the truth that all the adults had been dancing around. This wasn't a negotiation. This wasn't a business transaction. This was an attempt to corrupt something pure, something sacred, something that existed beyond the reach of market forces. The guard's partner, standing at the opposite post, remained equally motionless. But there was something in his stillness that suggested he was aware of every word, every movement, every breath of the drama unfolding mere yards away. This was a brotherhood forged in discipline, and an attack on one was an attack on all. Blackwood's security team exchanged worried glances. They'd seen their employer in difficult situations before, but never anything like this. Never a situation where his money not only couldn't solve the problem, but was actually making it worse. The head of security, a former Navy SEAL named Marcus, stepped closer to his employer. "Sir," Marcus whispered, "maybe it's time to—" "No," Blackwood snapped, his voice loud enough to carry across the courtyard. "No, we're not leaving. Not until this tin soldier understands that everyone has a price." The words hung in the air like poison gas. Several tourists actually stepped back, as if physical distance could protect them from the toxicity of what they'd just heard. But the guard absorbed those words the same way he absorbed everything else, with perfect stillness and unbreakable composure. Then something unprecedented happened. From somewhere in the crowd, a slow clap began. Just one person at first, then another, then another. Within moments, the entire courtyard erupted in applause. Not for the billionaire and his money, but for the guard who had remained unmoved by it all. The applause rolled over Blackwood like a tsunami of rejection. Every clap was a vote against his worldview. Every smile in the crowd was directed not at his wealth, but at the man who had shown it meant nothing. For the first time in his adult life, Richard Blackwood was on the losing side of public opinion, but he still wasn't finished. Desperation had taken hold now, the kind of desperate hunger that drives sharks to attack anything that moves in the water. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out something that made even his own security team uncomfortable. A contract. $500,000, he announced, his voice now shrill with panic. $500,000, and I'll put it in writing. A contract, legal, binding. All you have to do is acknowledge that I exist. The paper fluttered in his hands like a white flag of surrender that he refused to wave. But contracts, like money, were tools of his world. And this guard existed in a different universe entirely, one where honor couldn't be bought, sold, or litigated. The crowd's applause had died down, replaced by something more powerful: complete silence. Even the street performers had stopped their acts. Even the traffic seemed quieter. The entire world had contracted down to this moment, this confrontation between two completely incompatible worldviews. In that silence, the guard finally moved. Not his whole body, not his head. Just his chest, expanding with one deep breath. It was such a small movement that most people missed it entirely, but Blackwood saw it. And in that single breath, he finally understood what he was up against. This wasn't a man who could be bought, because this wasn't really about the man at all. This was about something larger. Something that had existed for centuries before Blackwood was born and would exist for centuries after he was gone. This was about duty, honor, and service to something greater than oneself. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the stomach. All his life, he'd believed that everything could be reduced to a transaction. Every relationship, every achievement, every moment of human connection could be quantified and purchased. But standing before him was living proof that some things existed beyond the reach of market forces. The guard's eyes moved again, just a fraction of an inch. just enough to glance down at the contract in Blackwood's hands. And in that glance was something that made the billionaire's blood run cold. Not hatred, not anger, not even contempt. Something worse, pity. For a heartbeat that lasted an eternity, their eyes met again. And in that moment, Blackwood saw himself as the guard saw him, not as a successful businessman or a powerful figure or even as a human being deserving of respect. He saw himself as something small, something pathetic, something to be pitied. The guard's eyes returned to the horizon. The moment was over, but its impact would last forever. Around them, the crowd began to disperse. The show was over, but not in the way anyone had expected. Phones were still recording, but the videos being uploaded now told a different story. This wasn't about a stubborn soldier or an eccentric billionaire. This was about the day dignity defeated dollars. Blackwood stood there for another long minute, holding his worthless contract and his meaningless money. His security team waited at a respectful distance, giving their employer time to process his defeat. But some defeats are too complete to process, too total to understand. Finally, with movements that seemed decades older than they had an hour before, Blackwood began to fold the contract. His hand shook as he put the money back in his briefcase. His designer's shoes felt heavy as lead as he turned away from the guard. As he walked back through the crowd, people stepped aside to let him pass. But it wasn't the respectful deference he was used to. It was something else entirely. It was the way people step aside for something damaged, something broken, something that had lost more than just a confrontation. Behind him, the royal guard remained at his post, motionless, dignified, unchanged by the encounter that had fundamentally altered the man who had challenged him. The guard would stand there for the rest of his shift, just as countless guards had stood before him and countless more would stand after. But Richard Blackwood would never be the same. The helicopter blades chopped through the London sky as Blackwood's private aircraft lifted him away from the scene of his humiliation. Through the window, Buckingham Palace grew smaller, but the memory of those pale blue eyes seemed to grow larger with every passing minute. His assistant sat across from him, tablet in hand, already managing the crisis. "Sir, the videos are going viral," she reported, her voice carefully neutral. "We're trending on every platform, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram. The hashtag money vs honor has been shared over 2 million times in the last hour." Blackwood didn't respond. He was staring out the window, but he wasn't seeing the London skyline. He was seeing something else entirely. He was seeing himself through the eyes of that guard, and he didn't like what he found there. Back at the palace, the changing of the guard ceremony continued as if nothing had happened. But something had happened, something that would ripple outward from this moment like stones thrown into still water. The tourists who had witnessed the confrontation would tell their friends. The videos would be shared millions more times. And somewhere in all of that sharing, a message would spread. The guard who had stood so perfectly still began his march to the guardhouse. His shift was over, but his duty was eternal. As he walked, his steps measured and precise, he carried with him the satisfaction of a job well done. Not just the job of standing guard, but the job of defending something precious against those who would corrupt it. In the guardhouse, he would remove his bearskin hat and hang up his rifle. He would change from his ceremonial red tunic into civilian clothes. But he would never change what had happened in that courtyard. He would never change the moment when dignity had faced down dollars and emerged victorious. Meanwhile, the videos continued to spread. News outlets picked up the story. Billionaire offers $500,000 to Royal Guard, gets lesson in dignity instead. The comments sections exploded with reactions from around the world. People shared their own stories of moments when money had failed to buy what money couldn't buy. A teacher in Tokyo wrote about refusing a bribe to change a student's grade. A nurse in Mumbai shared her story of turning down gifts from pharmaceutical companies. A police officer in Sao Paulo described saying no to corruption even when his family needed the money. The Royal Guard's silent stand had given voice to millions of people who had chosen honor over profit, but perhaps the most powerful response came from an unexpected source. Blackwood's own daughter, a college student at Stanford, posted a video of her own. In it, she sat in her dorm room, tears in her eyes, talking about watching her father's humiliation play out in real time on social media. "I love my dad," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "But today I was ashamed of him, not because he failed to buy that guard's smile, but because he tried to. Because he thought that everything good in this world could be purchased. Because he forgot that some things are priceless precisely because they can't be bought." Her video was shared even more widely than the original footage. Children of wealthy parents around the world began speaking out about the pressure to believe that money solved everything. A movement began, small at first but growing, of young people rejecting the idea that wealth was the measure of worth. The guard never saw these videos. He never read the comments or the news articles. He didn't have social media accounts or seek recognition for what he'd done. To him, it had been just another day at work. Just another moment when duty had been tested and had proven strong. 3 months later, Blackwood received an unexpected package at his Silicon Valley office. Inside was a simple card with the Royal Guard insignia and a brief message. "Some things cannot be bought because they are not for sale. They can only be earned through service to something greater than oneself." The card was unsigned, but Blackwood knew where it had come from. He kept it on his desk, not as a trophy or a reminder of defeat, but as something else entirely. As a compass pointing toward a different way of measuring value. The guard never knew about the card he'd inspired someone to send. He never knew about the millions of people who had watched his silent stand and felt something stir in their hearts. He never knew about the young people who had chosen different paths because of his example. He simply continued to do his duty. Day after day, shift after shift, he stood guard over something precious. Not just a building or a person, but an idea. The idea that some things in this world are sacred, that some principles cannot be compromised. That dignity is not a commodity to be traded in the marketplace of human desires. Years would pass. Blackwood would eventually donate most of his fortune to charity, saying only that he had learned the difference between having wealth and being wealthy. The guard would retire after decades of service, passing his duty on 2 younger shoulders, but never forgetting the lessons that duty had taught him. But the moment they shared in that courtyard would live forever, in the videos that would never be deleted, in the stories that would be passed down from generation to generation, in the hearts of everyone who had watched a simple act of dignity defeat all the money in the world. Because in the end, that's what it had been. Not a confrontation between rich and poor, or American and British, or civilian and soldier. It had been a confrontation between 2 different ways of seeing the world. One that said everything could be bought, and one that said some things never would be. The guard had one without saying a word, without moving a muscle, without acknowledging that a contest had even taken place. He had won simply by being what he had always been, a man who understood that true power comes not from what you can buy, but from what you refuse to sell. And in that victory, something precious had been preserved. Something that money couldn't touch, influence couldn't corrupt, and time couldn't diminish. Something that would stand guard over the human spirit long after the last camera had stopped recording and the last dollar had been counted. The Royal Guard had done more than protect a palace that day. He had protected the idea that honor is not for sale, that dignity cannot be purchased, and that some things in this world will always be worth more than all the money that ever existed. In the silence of his perfect stillness, he had spoken volumes, and the world had listened.